So when I ask certain questions and things like that, I really do appreciate it when people are interactive. So if you can use the chat or the Q&A section, raise a hand, anything like that, or you can also unmute yourself, then I would love it, because I'd just love to hear from people and not feel like I'm speaking into the digital void. Okay, so what are we covering today? We're looking at relevance and consistency of language, acronyms, reclaiming and etymology, and pronouncing. Okay, so for those of you who didn't join yesterday, just to say why I feel that I'm in a position to do this work. I have a politics and philosophy degree, and I did a lot of stuff around identity politics, around race, around gender, stuff around logic, the process of like taking in knowledge. So epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge, like what even is knowledge and how do we engage with it. And then also, I suppose, something that's relevant to today is I also did philosophy of literature. That was a module that I did as well. PGC in mathematics. I've got a background as a teacher, so I feel I have empathy and can speak to this sector and this demographic, and why this program and this project is relevant to schools. Also, I'm an artist, so I'm known very much as a poet, a spoken word artist, as a writer, theatre maker, musician, and I've dealt with topics of race, gender, class, intersectionality, colonial history in my work. Today I've thrown in the fact that I've got an A-level in English language as well, because we're talking about language, so just so you know that. And I have devised and I deliver anti-racism training on behalf of Contact in Manchester, but I'm not an expert. I always like to end with that, just to say I feel that I've had an experience in an academic journey, which has allowed me to be privy to some information and theories and whatever else. But at the end of the day, it's all come through me, it's come through my lens, and I'm working on behalf of the World Reimagined right now, but we are not the oracles. We are trying our best to share some good practice and some good work, but there are other people out there doing amazing work and saying slightly different things. So just want to put that out there. So before we go any further, because today's all about language, I thought a nice question to start us off would be, what's your favourite word? So anyone want to put in the chat or want to unmute themselves and just tell me, have you got a favourite word? What's your favourite word? Just off the top of your head, don't overthink it. What's the first word that comes into your head? A word that just gives you a little bit of joy. Let's see who's actually listening. So, favourite word?
Hi.
Hi, Chris.
The first word that popped into my head was a Turkish one, which is teşekkürler, which is like thank you very much.
Ah, nice.
And it's very specific to it being Turkish and those sounds as much as the meaning. Nice. So that was literally the first thing that popped into my head.
Cool, thank you for sharing. Someone else, favourite word? You can put it in the chat or you can say it. Come on, let's hear one more person's favourite word. Don't be shy. Okay, I'll let you off. I'm not happy about this. So I'll share my two, because I can never decide and it changes from day to day. But the two that jumped into my head, I've probably even misspelt these, is frangipani and discombobulated. I just love these two words. They make me giggle. They're very long. They kind of jump around in the mouth. So yeah, they're my two favourite words, frangipani and discombobulated. Okay, so Relevance and consistency. When is it relevant to bring up someone's race? I want you to consider this question. There are times when someone's race gets mentioned and it can be quite loaded. So we do need to be mindful of when we do that and question why we're doing it and if it's necessary. So I feel that there's no right or wrong answer to this question. So the way that I go about approaching it is to just consider, are you being consistent? And where does the power lie when you bring it in? So I'm going to share a passage on the next slide, but I just want you to think about, how consistent are you when you bring up someone's race? Is it that it's only when it's a certain demographic that you bring it up, maybe? And who are you? What's your racial background? What's your ethnicity? How does that relate to the way that you use race in your language? These are just very difficult questions, I imagine, but very needed when we're considering when we do this work and how we do this work. So this is the wonderful Zadie Smith. She has amazing novels and essays, days. She's a lecturer, and she wrote a book called Northwest. I don't know if anyone knows it here, has read it. I definitely recommend it. It's brilliant. I think it also got turned into a drama on the BBC, but it's called NW, Northwest. And this is a passage from an article where she was interviewed about the book. And she says, I grew up reading a generation of American and English people like Saul Bellow and John Updike or Martin Amis. Everyone's neutral unless they're Black. Then you hear about it. The Black man, the Black woman, the Black person. Of course, if you happen to be Black, the world doesn't look like you. I just wanted to try to create perhaps a sense of alienation and otherness in this person, the white reader, to remind them that they are not neutral to other people. So what she's getting at is, in this book, Northwest, she does something that is so small, but it's so impactful. So any character that is Black, she doesn't say it. So she just gives their name or whatever, she just describes them, but she never mentions that they're Black. Every other character, she mentions it. So if there's a white man speaking or a white woman doing something or a white person, she'll mention that. And I remember being at the launch for this book at the Manchester Literature Festival, and a white woman put her hand up and asked her why she'd done that. And she responded with the same kind of, rhetoric. It would have been, slightly different, but same kind of answer. And she said to the woman, how did it make you feel? And she said, oh, it just made me feel uncomfortable and I don't know why. And she was like, well, that's how I feel when I'm reading so many other novels, that for some reason it's necessary to state when someone is Black, but it's not necessary to state when they're white. And it just makes me feel othered all the time. So I just decided to do the opposite. And clearly it's had that effect on you. So I think this is really powerful. And I took this on when I was writing my second solo show, Man on the Moon. I did a similar thing. So whenever someone was Black, I didn't merely state it, but if they were from a different ethnicity, then I stated it, because I just felt like, again, I wanted to follow in her footsteps with kind of just shifting the dynamic and centering yourself for a change. So just being good just now, just to hear if anyone's got any responses to that or questions or reflections on that. Do you feel that by me bringing this up, have you had a think of, oh, am I consistent, or do I bring up race when it's not always relevant. I can keep talking while someone unmutes or puts something in the chat, but I've got another little anecdote. I've got a friend who is a very well-known actor, and he doesn't like it when he's been interviewed and they describe him as a Black actor. He says he just doesn't think that it's relevant all the time unless the play is specifically about race or the article is specifically about him doing something in terms of representation or something like that. He just doesn't see why they have to say Black actor. He says what he would prefer though is if they said something like British Nigerian, that would be fine, because then he feels like it's just a bit more personal. It's not political. They're talking about his heritage and he feels more represented. But yeah, he makes an effort to tell editors or interviewers or journalists whenever he's interacting with them, don't describe me in that way, because so many people just do it as a default and don't really consider like why it is that they're doing it and that they've brought it up. Yeah, so I'll just give a bit of space to see if anyone's got any questions or reflections on that, and then I'll move on to the next point. Thanks for joining us, Ruth. Okay, I'll move on. Acronyms. So this is one that I'm sure we've all come across. So actually, if I'm being super pedantic and being the linguist that I am, you've got acronyms and then you've got alphabetisms. So alphabetisms can't be said as a word. So this is an acronym because you could say BAME, but if it was BME, for example, then it would be an alphabetism because you wouldn't actually be able to say it as a word in its own right. So I'm sure a lot of us have come across this phrase before, BAME, and it stands for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. And I don't like it. I know a lot of people that don't like it. I remember an artist, a director called Matthew Zia, saying that he just finds it so clumsy because Black is like, it's a colour and it's a political phrase, really. And then Asian, that's actually got like some geography attached to it. And then he said minority ethnic just kind of mops up everything afterwards. So it just feels so kind of dismissive and clumsy. And he really doesn't like it. And I remember him saying this about 3-4 years ago. And what's happened, especially during lockdown, is there's been a lot around pushing back on this phrase. And yeah, people essentially saying that they don't want it to be used anymore and they don't feel that it's helpful. So I'm just going to give a bit of context to that. There's an organization called Inkcarts, and they've got a campaign which is called BAME Over. And they've released a statement. So they did a series of workshops. I attended some of them. They consulted with people. And essentially they were pushing back on this phrase. So we think that it's come from kind of like not arts council speak, funders. So funders like the Arts Council, but I don't know if they specifically coined it, but funders or councils, kind of bodies where they have to evaluate people, draft up forms where you tick boxes and say where you're from and things like that. And it seems that it's come from that world, this phrase BAME. So it had its function, it had its place, but what happened is it's been used more and more and in different contexts to a point where now people just feel like they just don't like it. They don't like the way it's being used. And essentially it's just kind of homogenizing, grouping a whole bunch of people together. And it's not always clear as to why that is. So Inkcarts have released this statement, and I'm not going to go through it all, but I'm just going to hone in on some sections that get at what they're advices around pushing back on this phrase. So they've said, BAME over, our terms of reference. We do not want to be grouped into a meaningless collective term or reduced to acronyms. We are African diaspora people. We are Southeast and Southeast Asian diaspora people. We are Middle East and North Africa people. We are ethnically diverse. We are people who experience racism. Use these terms in any order you choose, but do not use BAME. And then they give 8 different rules of engagement. So I think that this is a very interesting campaign. I think it's very clear. I think it's very bold. They've been doing a lot of lobbying, speaking to different groups. I know they've been speaking to government. I was part of an event called What Next, where we were having to speak to Sir Keir Starmer, and he used the phrase. And yeah, the chat box went wild in the Zoom chat, and everyone was kind of like, don't use that phrase, and da 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 da. And yeah, it was just nice to see it in action, to see that people are taking up this campaign, taking it upon themselves and pushing for that change. And this is what I was kind of getting at yesterday in the session, in making that distinction between being not racist and being anti-racist. So you can have a view, you can kind of know that, oh, probably shouldn't use this acronym, or feels a bit weird, or, oh, I've heard that people are not really using that anymore. And you can kind of just know that and just get on with your everyday, but that doesn't create any kind of change. So if you're up for engaging with being anti-racist, then you really do need to take that next step. You have to be up for being in a situation where you might hear someone say the phrase BAME and you go, oh, should we use that? Or have you heard about this campaign? Or I'm sure there's another way that we can word that. Or do you actually know the person's race that you're talking about there? Or what group are we talking about? Is it relevant for us to talk about race right now? So those kinds of questions. And as I was saying before, the thing that we're really trying to get at with this whole program, with the learning program, with this whole project of the World Reimagined, is let's turn our judgment into curiosity. Let's reimagine what the future could be like. Let's connect to each other. Let's be compassionate. Let's be courageous. Let's have difficult conversations. Let's be critical thinkers. And one of the ways that we can do that is just with questions, with just starting conversation. So we're not asking anyone to be like overtly contentious here. We know that that is quite a big ask, but all we're asking you to do is question yourself and question others around you and see if you can create space for change. So I'm going to pop this link in the chat for anyone that wants to check it out in their own time. Oh, Maria put something in the chat and I didn't see it, sorry. Oh, so this was that about Zadie Smith, Maria, when you're saying it's an interesting juxtaposition to readers? I'm going to presume so. Okay. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it is. It's just a subtle change. But yeah, I definitely do. I mean, the book in its own right is a great book, but I encourage you to read it if you've not had that kind of experience of reading. And I don't want to make any assumptions about your background or your race, but yeah, when you are either then shoved into being in the center or shoved into being on the periphery, when it's usually the other way around, it can be quite impactful in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. So yeah, I've just put the link in the chat there for Inkcarts if anyone's interested in that. It's a really great organization. They do loads of interesting campaigns, but yeah, the BAME over one is super, super interesting. Okay. So next thing about acronyms, there's so many things to say about acronyms. So I've really like simmered this down and tried to pick the ones that I think are the most interesting and relevant to us. Okay, so I definitely need some interaction here. Has anyone seen any of these acronyms before? And if you have, do you know what they might stand for. So I'm just going to leave that up and have that question lingering in the air. What are these acronyms about? Black, Indigenous, people of colour, yeah. So BIPOC. Correct, Anna. Any of the others? I'll be honest, the others are a lot younger. Yes, British, East and Southeast Asian, yep. Bingo, bingo. Anyone get the last one? Or the first one even? Yeah, Middle East and North African, thank you. Perfecto. So it's quite a minefield, isn't it? So I've just shown an example of an acronym that was very problematic, that's had a lot of contention around it, and people have pushed back on it, and many people have been vocal about it. They're not wanting it to be used anymore. And now I'm showing you 3 acronyms that are very live and active. I've seen them being used, and at the moment, they seem to be appropriate. So that's the whole thing with language, in that I think in terms of us just wanting to get through life and want an easy life, we want there to be a blanket rule for things, right? But there just isn't. And I think once we get over that with language and understand that it's transient, that it changes, that it depends on the context it's been used and where it comes from, then it will help us to navigate it a lot easier. So these 3 acronyms I've seen being used in a very positive way. And I think what the difference is that they've come from the communities that they represent. So I've learned these 3 from engaging with artists or writers or colleagues who are from these communities, and they've been able to tell me where it's come from, why they're comfortable with using it, and they've used it in their own context, and I'll follow suit. So I, for example, have not had to use any of these acronyms yet so far in the work that I'm doing. But if it does come to a point where I'm working on a project and whatever else, then I will do so, but I'll make sure that I check in with the people that it represents to know that they're comfortable with it first, or else there's just no point in me using it. And then I just need to make sure that I'm being consistent, right? But I think the main thing to say is that it's about you checking with the people that it's connected to, but also checking on the context. Because I remember being in a meeting, I think, and someone used BIPOC, but to represent the UK, and it just didn't work. It just didn't land well. So I know that when it gets used in Australia or in America, then it makes sense, right? Because we know that in those places, the Indigenous people are being oppressed, and they are deemed as being ethnic minorities in some of those contexts. But to use that phrase here in the UK, it just didn't make sense. It kind of crossed the wires, and it didn't translate very well. So that person had to be called out, and it was just like, oh, I think you're using that phrase in the wrong way, or it's not applying to who you think that it applies to, and those kind of things. So we might see a word or a phrase that looks very effective and it's being used well, but still that doesn't necessarily mean that you can immediately appropriate it and put it in a different context. So that's the point that I wanted to make there. Okay. Another acronym to get our heads around, TST. So TST stands for Transatlantic Slave Trade. Now, at the World Reimagined, we felt like it was really important for us to come up with our own definition. We did a lot of reading, looked at a lot of different organisations, heritage centres, books, articles that have definitions. And then we kind of use those as a reference point to create our own. We are all about creating space for conversation for the UK to discuss our relationship with the transatlantic slave trade. So that's why it seemed really important for us to interrogate our understanding of it as a cohort, as a team of people, and then put it out there. So this is the definition that we've got in our school resources, because for every single module that we've released, we've also released a glossary so that you can know what we're on about. Because as we know, language is a barrier, and it's such a joyous playground, I will say, as someone who is a linguist, as a writer, but I know that also it can be so intimidating for people. And it's one of the first things that if you don't know a word, you just won't engage. You'll switch off, stop listening, you'll close a book, you're done. You're like, I don't understand, I'm out. So we're really keen to make sure that we're using the right language, but that we're also creating the right level of access so that people feel that they can come along on this journey with us. So I'm just going to share what we've put together as a definition. So between 1500 and 1900, a process of trade occurred between Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, South America, and North America, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Motivated by financial interest, Europeans used force to enslave millions of people from West Africa and West Central Africa. Enslaving involves brutally capturing and displacing people, then continuing to strip them of all their human rights to make them work for free. They were ordinary people with families and jobs. Many were farmers, merchants, priests, goldsmiths, artists, doctors, and soldiers. These enslaved people were uprooted brutally to work on plantations for sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and rice. Many millions died on the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Many more died on the plantations, with lives shortened by intense labor and devastating living conditions. The plantations' owners from Britain and other European countries gained great wealth from this labor and trade. This wealth shaped the structure of cities and institutions throughout the UK. It influenced British culture. It established power and influence for generations. The impact is still seen in British society today. Okay, so that's our definition. And as we were doing this work, we came across a different phrase. I had a conversation with a few academics and artists who work with colonial histories as a theme. And they mentioned a slightly different phrase, which is transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. So instead of transatlantic slave trade, they were saying that this is a preferable phrase. So my question to you is, what do you think the difference is? So in changing from transatlantic slave trade to transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, what do you feel the difference is if we are to use this phrase instead? The human aspect. Emma said blame and responsibility. Anna said, yeah. So yeah, just to connect to what you said, Emma, yeah, the trafficking bit. So we were saying that when you say transatlantic slave trade, there's something about it that means it creates a kind of distance. So the word slave makes you think of the way that it does what it's supposed to do, because it's supposed to dehumanize, and it makes you think about kind of property. But if we use the phrase trafficking, that lands with us more, that feels more contemporary, and we can think about humans being moved across the Atlantic for the purpose of slavery, to be enslaved. So yeah, I agree with you that it brings that human aspect back into it. Anna, you said it brings in blame and responsibility. Absolutely. So it again, it shows that directional thing. So it's not just saying slave and just leaving it there and not kind of discussing the relationship. It's like the trafficking, the movement, the asymmetry of this is a group of people who were oppressed. It brings the activity into the understanding. Back into this people. Oh, Marie, sorry. I think your questions came in as sometimes coming in a bit late. I don't know why. So when would this be suitable? I personally wouldn't use BIPOC. Sorry, we're just harking back. I'm just referring to Marie's question about BIPOC. I personally wouldn't use BIPOC in a UK context because I just think the word Indigenous has a different type of meaning here to what it originally meant when it was coined in Australia. That's where I've heard it's mainly in Australia that I've heard it being used. And I just think that it means something very, very different here. So it doesn't transfer as well for me. And your other comment, the acknowledgement of the act on slavery on people. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, what we've done in our resources, because we were kind of like to and fro, and we were like, oh yeah, we definitely want to acknowledge this phrase, but we still need to be aware of the fact that more people are familiar with transatlantic slave trade. So we've got both. So we've got the definition for transatlantic slave trade in our resources with that definition that I've just shared with you. And then underneath it, we've got this phrase, and we've said, this is an alternative phrase that has a very similar meaning, but for some people, the focus on the human aspect of use, as you've said, is more suitable and more appropriate. And we just kind of acknowledge the fact that this phrase is out there, and hopefully it will become more established. So yeah, I think we've already discussed that. Has the emphasis shifted? It has. So before we jump to a little break, I just wanted to ask thoughts on that phrase. Do you feel like that's something that you might use going forward? The transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. Yeah, and I said definitely. Yeah. Seems more appropriate. Yeah, because one thing that I've noticed, and I've been mindful of with my language, is it seems that more and more people are wanting to use the word slave less and use the word enslaved. And it's so subtle, but again, it just brings in that level of accountability, culpability, and rehumanizes the people that we're talking about, as opposed to making it sound as though it's a very kind of permanent label, let's say. It gives you that sense of like, no, this is a thing that happened to people. This label was put upon them, or this was an experience that they had, as opposed to making it like a noun, let's say. So yeah, in that way, I have been trying my best to use this phrase more so, but I'm having to like, you know, jump between the two, because you want to take people on that journey with you, and what people are way more familiar with transatlantic slave trade. And it's just about us doing that good work and explaining that there are more phrases out there and what the difference could be. But essentially, I don't think that the definition necessarily changes. Okay, so I'm aware that I've been talking quite a lot. So I'm gonna put us on a break. We're probably gonna finish before 7 today. You'll be happy to know, because we're getting through all the things that I wanted to do a lot quicker, because I never know how many people are gonna turn up for these things. So I have to plan accordingly. And we had about 24 people sign up. Yeah, so I'm going to say 5 minutes, and then we'll start up again, just so you've got some breathing time, you've got a bit of time to process what I've said, or think of any questions that you might have for me. So yeah, if we can all come back here at 5:46, that would be lovely. Thank you, Maria. Hello, hello, hello. I hope you've come back to join me. Okay, so let us continue with this talk on language. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is reclaiming and etymology. So I'm going to share a little story with you, which is called My Mulatto Story. So just for context, I identify as being mixed race. My mum is from Guyana in South America. Her dad is Portuguese, white Caucasian man. And her mother is West African as far as we know, because she is from Guyana, but she's Black, and we know that from colonial history that she would have come from that part of the world, but because of history, she doesn't know specifically where. So it's likely that it could have been Ghana or Nigeria, Mali, anywhere like that, but we don't know specifically where. My dad, a bit more complicated. He's Jamaican. His dad's from Cuba. His mum was also Jamaican, and just visually, I know that there's a lot going on in terms of my dad's line. Yeah, so let's put it there. It's got very interesting hair textures and various shades in my family and freckles and all sorts going on. It's very fun. So yeah, basically just coming back to focus, I identify as being mixed race, and I was in contact with a guy who likes to set up events, wonderful man, DJ, and he wanted to set up an event which was celebrating Black and brown women. His wife is Puerto Rican, and he wanted to call the event Mulatto. And I said to him, I don't think I can come to your event. And he said, why? And I went, I'm really not comfortable with the name. And he was like, why? And I said, do you know what mulatto means? And he was like, oh, doesn't it mean mixed race? And I was like, well, It does, but from a very contentious context. So I was like, it's derived from the 16th century. It's a Spanish word for mule. And a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. And the word mulatto was used specifically within the context of slavery to describe enslaved people who were mixed race. So they were basically making a direct comparison between mixed race people and mules. And that's, as far as my reading and understanding of the word, that was the context of it. So I was like, that's where it sits for me. So I was like, I do not like the word. I don't use the word, and I definitely wouldn't be going to an event that is called that word. And then he was like, yeah, I kind of knew that. It was weird. He was kind of saying that he knew where it was from, but didn't know where it's from, or didn't know that it was offensive, let's say. And I was like, well, I'm not speaking for everyone, but I'm just saying for me, I know where the words come from, and I don't like the words. So I'm really sorry if I'm being overly sensitive, but I can't go to an event that has that as the title. And he was like, oh, but can't we reclaim it? Can't we reclaim it? And that's where it just got more complicated, because I was trying to explain to him that he's not in a place of reclamation. He cannot. So I was trying to say, like, as a white man, you're not in the position to reclaim this word, because the heritage of it, the history of it, means that white men would have been the ones wielding this word and oppressing other people with this word. So how can you reclaim it? Like, it could only be on the other side. It could only be like me. I could reclaim it. Your wife could reclaim it. But I was like, but I don't want to. It's like, I actually am not out here trying to reclaim this word. And I definitely don't want you reclaiming it on my behalf. So yeah, it wasn't a like emotionally contentious conversation. It was very rational, and we were just kind of listening to each other's sides and stuff. And I said to him, look, I'm very supportive of your event and what you're trying to do. And I know that he has really good intentions, and he's very like culturally respectful. But I just said, on this occasion, we don't agree, and I'm not going to come to your event, and I can't promote it either. I'm not going to be like sharing it on my Facebook. Sorry, but I was like, all the best of it. And then I think a few weeks later, I think he cancelled the event, or he changed the name or whatever. But I remember it didn't happen anyway. I remember that word did go away, and I do wonder if he had other people challenge him. So yeah, I just wonder if anyone's got any questions around that, or thoughts around reclaiming. Has anyone else had any discussions around that concept of reclamation and who can do that and when you can do that? And it also depends on the context. If you're going to reclaim a word, you need to know where it's come from first, and just decide whether you do want to reclaim it, or if you're the right person to reclaim it. So yeah, I'm just going to give space and see if anyone else has got any other examples. No. Okie dokie. Okay, so the next thing, owning context of pride. Yeah, please go for it. Go for it, Emma. Don't know if you want to unmute or say any more in the chat.
Hi, sorry, it might be a bit rambly again, so I do apologise. We are working on a Pride 1981 project, and worked with some lovely artists who originally performed at Pride 1981 and we got the songs together that they worked on, everything, and I had to check through several several people that I was allowed to republish these on all of our channels because of the words that we used there that could be deemed offensive but were kind of reclaimed at that time by lesbians at that time. So it was just constantly checking that, is that still okay? Can I still do that? Is that okay? But it's obviously, it wasn't for me to go, yes, that's great, but it was having to check through the right channels to make sure we got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just that thing that you're saying, it's just check and check with the right people. I've been in so many situations where someone will go, oh, it's not offensive to me, and I'm like, well, of course it's not offensive to you. The word's got nothing to do with you. Like, you're not in that community, or you're not you're not on the other end of it, like, or it's so it's just like you're not the arbiter of it. And it's just knowing that of thinking, okay, is this word okay, but who for, and who needs to be given space and voice to okay this. And that's all it takes, really, as you're saying, is checking and then being able to give context, because sometimes you'll get mixed messages as well. You won't always get the same answer from different people, but at least you can then say, oh, I checked with this person, or I know that for this community it's not okay, or in this context it's not all right, but we're actually using it here and we wouldn't dare use it blah 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 elsewhere. It's just being able to say that you know that you've done your research. Marie said, interesting to consider the use of words and language. Absolutely. It's just the function. Go back to the function. If you're going to reclaim a word, if you're going to push it onto a journey of semantic change, you've got to know how it was being used before, how it's being used now, and if this is the time for creating that change, and if you're the right person to do it. All of those things. Questions. That's what it all comes back to. Anyway, okay, so the next thing I want to do is to just share a passage from a brilliant book from the writer and musician Akala. He does wonderful talks around this topic all around the world, and he brought this book out probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I really do have a warped sense of time now, I think, as we all can appreciate. Anything that I think happened 3 years ago, I have to add 2 years on and be like, oh yeah, lockdown. So I'm just going to read a passage from his book on white privilege, because I think that's a phrase that we know is quite loaded, can be quite triggering for a lot of people, very contentious for a lot of people. And yeah, I just think he brings a very interesting reflection on it in his book. And this is from a chapter that is called, sorry, let me just go. So the chapter itself is called The Day I Realised My Mum Was White, but this is right near the end of it. So he says, class affects everything, even racism, but in complex ways. And a phrase like white privilege is not an absolute, but a trend. A verifiable factor in human history produced by the philosophy and practice of institutionalized white supremacy. The idea that millions of white people still being relatively poor somehow proves that white privilege does not exist is such a juvenile and historically illiterate argument. I'm surprised that it is taken at all seriously. There were poor whites in the Jim Crow South, in apartheid South Africa, and the slave colonies of the Caribbean. Yet no one would be silly enough, with the benefit of historical distance, to claim that white privilege did not exist back then. But at the time, poor whites in Saint Dominique, excuse me, for example, felt and claimed to be oppressed because they were too poor to own slaves. The practice of legally privileging all people racialized as white literally came about so ruling groups could buy the racial loyalty of poor whites, not to entirely eradicate their poverty. Thus, you will hear people talking about the white working class in Britain as if whiteness infers indigeneity, even though most immigrants to Britain, even before we joined the EU, have been white people. This is why, in spite of all the suffering of poor people in Britain, there was a Keep Britain White campaign and not a Keep Britain Celtic or Norman or Saxon one. These people understood very well what whiteness meant to them emotionally and psychologically, even if its material benefits were meagre. The mental and emotional benefits of whiteness are why my granddad, working class, a soldier who had been tortured in battle, an uneducated alcoholic with few serious accomplishments to speak of, could still say, well, at least I'm not an N-word, as frequently as he did. What did my grandfather understand about whiteness that so many pretend they cannot? And it's also why, though my mum was far from rich and had great many sufferings of her own to speak of, she still shared a degree of racial discomfort when faced by questioning eyes of her 5-year-old son. But she sought and led him to answers and did her best to rise to the challenge of staring at her, to rise to the challenge that was staring at her from this little person she had created. Okay. Apologies about all my fumbling there. So yeah, I just think that's a really interesting passage. I think he does a really great job of mixing really big academic ideas and references with something that feels very accessible, anecdotal, personal. And yeah, I think he's quite provocative. I think he says stuff that you're like, okay, yeah, I feel challenged by that. How do I feel about that? Do I actually agree? So I think he's a brilliant writer. Marine's put this links with how we speak and regional and cultural meaning. Yeah. So I think what's great about that passage is it kind of, he points at this thing that we do in Britain where we kind of flip-flop when we want to commit to the concept of white supremacy or white privilege and when we don't. And it's very much about our use of the word whiteness and what we mean when we say that, because sometimes when we're saying it, we don't actually mean white. Like you were saying, you know, how is it that it's being used in such an umbrella way that's encompassing white immigrants, but sometimes those kind of people are excluded or acknowledged in the same way? Why isn't it that it wasn't Saxon or Anglo or whatever else? So there is a validity, there's a power in using the word white, and it is about its status. So when it's then wrapped up and used in a context to kind of speak to kind of class oppression and things like that, then it's very contentious and it's very insidious, actually. And we're seeing it being done right now in various spheres, and I won't be any more specific than that. So does anyone want to say anything about that or ask any questions or give any reflections before I move on? I've got a few more points to make about this, so I'll just keep going. So yeah, for anyone that joined me yesterday, I was kind of explaining the fact that the phrase white supremacy predates the word racism by 80 years. So when we have any kind of issue with a phrase, or it makes us feel uncomfortable, or we feel that we don't fully understand it, one of the first things that I say to people is go and check where it's from. Go and check how long ago it's been used. Where did it come from? Why did it come from? Like, just check, because that will just clarify so much. And I think knowing this fact, it's the reason why I brought it up again today, just creates so much clarity. The concept that whiteness was invented first and its supremacy before the concept of racism really does shift the focus and helps to move the conversation forward. Yeah, I agree. He's a very logical writer, very rational man. I wanted to bring this in as well. So as much as I know that I have an understanding of the concept of white supremacy and white privilege, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's not triggering for some people and that it just makes some people switch off. I was literally just doing some anti-racism training over the weekend, and a woman was having a very kind of comprehensive discussion with me around like neoliberalism and all that kind of stuff. We were very much on the same page. And then she was like, I don't like the phrase white privilege. Like, she's trying to do anti-racist work and stuff like that, but she was like, it just doesn't sit well with me. I don't feel like I'm privileged. I don't like it. Da 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 da. So I said, okay, that's fine, because, if I don't acknowledge that, then there's no progress. There's no point in me sitting here and trying to like bash you over the head with something. So I think another thing that we can consider is what other phrases, what other words are out there that can we share with people or negotiate with people that allows us to move the conversation forward. And there's a really great article which talks about moral look. So there are some theorists who have tried to move away from this phrase of privilege. Oh, it's taken a little while to load, and I'll put this link in the chat. And they've talked more about moral look because they think that that gets the idea across for people. So as Carlo was saying in his text there are people who will be experiencing other kinds of oppression, right? So it might be that you're from working class. It might be that you have a disability. It might be that you are from the LGBTQ community and you have had to experience homophobia or transphobia and those kind of things. So if you're having to deal with a different type of oppression, for someone to then say that you're privileged can feel very incongruent. But what we're talking about here is very much around race and the privilege and the dynamic of power just within that space. Obviously, we're all aware of intersectionality and that we can experience different layers of oppression. But that's why phrases like the white working class boys and things like that is very contentious, because I always ask, when has whiteness ever been a barrier in this country? And I say that very specifically, whiteness. Okay, because I said that in a workshop once doing anti-racism training, and a guy came back and was like, oh, but what about, my family are Irish and that whole history? And I went, oh yeah, absolutely. The way that the Irish were treated was absolutely horrendous. I said, I didn't say Irish, I said white. So it's how do we stick to this concept of understanding race as a social construct, understanding its history, understanding where it's come from, and how it's linked to structural racism, and how that is linked to white privilege and white supremacy. And if we can get on board with that, then we can move the conversation forward. But as we know, not everyone wants to hear that phrase. So then I offer the phrase moral look, and I always send people this article for them to read, and it seems to do the trick, which I think is super useful. So it's less about trying to say to someone, you've had a privileged life, but more saying you are in a demographic, which means that you are more likely to have experienced privilege, or even the fact that you feel that you have missed out, that you've not experienced privilege, still harks to the concept of privilege, right? Like if you feel like you are entitled to white privilege, then it still exists. So as Akala was getting at in his text there, just because there were poor white people in America during the times of slavery, it didn't stop the fact that being white was a privileged position in that country. Like, of course it doesn't. But for some reason, that argument is still being used here in this country to this day. Okay. So what I wanted you to do now, just based on what I've just said, is think of a word for yourself that is linked to this topic of race or racial equality. Any word that you think, it might be a word that you feel quite certain about. You're like, yeah, I know what this means. I know this word. or it could be a word that you hear and you're not really sure about. I want you to just go on your laptops, go on your phone or whatever, and just do a little search. Where has that word come from? When did it start being used? When was it coined? Yeah, so I want you to just do that for me. Just do a little search, find out where it's come from, and then see if you can find an alternative meaning or word or phrase or similar word that you could possibly jump to if you were in a situation where you had to use that word and it didn't really work. Are there any other words that you think that you could lend to help you explain? So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to do that. Oh, no worries, Maria. So I've just asked everyone to answer the 2 questions at the bottom of the page. So I've just said, pick a word linked to the topic of race, find out when it was coined, and find if there's an alternative word or a similar word that you could use if maybe you used this word and people didn't necessarily understand what you meant. So you've still got about, I was giving everyone 5 minutes, you've still got about 3 minutes if you wanted to do this. Okay. So, anyone want to share their word? What word did you decide to go on a little adventure with? Any surprises or affirmations? Anyone? Anyone? I struggled with it. Oh, interesting. In what way? Picking a word or trying to find an alternative? Okay. What was the word that you went for, Anna? Microaggression. Okay, interesting. Yeah. Okay. So when did that word start to, when you looked for the etymology, feels like quite a contemporary word, but I imagine it's probably been used earlier than we think. Oh, 1970, see? Yeah. Very, very interesting. So from the 1970s. Did it say anything about whether it was like American or anything like that? I really feel like it's an American phrase. There are some words that I'm more familiar with than not, like some that I've actually gone and done this stuff, but I've not done it with microaggressions. So I'm learning right now. Late 16th century. Yeah, coined by Chester M. Pierce at Harvard. Okay, interesting. And you struggled to find an alternative. Yeah, so I suppose it doesn't always have to be an alternative word. It can just be an alternative phrase, because for some people say microaggression, it just might mean nothing to them, and it's just, how can we be prepared for that? How can we, because as I was saying, language is the first barrier, right? And if we're thinking about being anti-racist, if we're thinking about change, we can't just stop at the first obstacle. It can't be that easy. So if someone's like, oh, I don't understand what a microaggression is, we need to feel like, oh, all right, that's fine. I can rephrase this, or maybe there's a different word or something that they can use. And I think for me, I say kind of small acts that might be intentional or unintentional, that feel on their own individually like they're not that much of an issue, but compounded, they really create the sense of oppression or discrimination. So I say small acts of kind of, some people say small acts of violence or small acts of prejudice geared towards a certain person, that may be intentional or not, but it doesn't really matter, because it's about the impact that it has on that person. It's about the kind of repetitiveness and the compounding nature of it. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. So Maria, you've said late 16th century. Was that you guessing as to when that word would have been used, or are you talking about a different word? You're looking up some words. Okay. So which word did you look up that was from the late 16th century? Okay, fair enough. Okie dokie, I hear you. But it's still good to check those words. So thank you for being courageous and picking some of the words that are a bit more distasteful, because we need to confront those words as well. They get used, and we need to know why, where, how, whether they're worthy of being reclaimed or not. So yeah, thank you for that. Okie dokie. So moving on to pronouncing. Okay, So who here has a nickname? I've got quite a few. I get called Kiki, I get called Quiche, I get called Lord of the Keisha with K. What else do I get called? What's another one? I used to have a friend that called me Customize because I'm always like changing things and editing things. I get called Key as well. Anyone else got a nickname that they want to share? Kenners. Yeah, nice. Yeah, I love using surnames as nicknames. I've got a few friends. I've got like a ridiculous amount of friends called Rachel. So always use their surnames like Morehouse and Banks and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I love doing that. Okay, so as we know, nicknames, they can be quite playful. It shows a level of intimacy. It's an informal mode of address. And yeah, nicknames can be quite useful. But when we're thinking of how they're used in a school context or school environment, it's something that we need to be very mindful of. So when I was training to be a teacher, I remember it was one of those days where we'd all come back to university and we were all kind of talking about our experiences. And there was a girl or a woman even on my course, and she started sharing this story. And she was talking about how she'd essentially nicknamed a student. She's like, oh, there's this student and I call her this because I can't pronounce her name. And she was like, oh, it's really funny. And, you know, everyone's joining in and everyone calls her this name now. And she was kind of relaying the story like it was a triumph, like she's managed to get everyone on board and she's had this rapport with this student and whatever. But immediately I just felt really uncomfortable. And I was just like, okay, how do I approach this? I'm just going to ask a series of questions. So I was like, where's the girl from? I wanted to get a sense of where this girl was from. Then I was like, did you ask the girl if that's what she wanted to be called? Was there kind of any consultation, or did you just decide, like you just changed her name? What are you going to call her when it's parents' evening? Will you use that name? Will you use the nickname? I wanted to know if she'd ever had someone give her a nickname without any kind of consultation, how that made her feel. So yeah, essentially just kept like asking questions. I was like, oh, do you struggle with long names in general? Because there are other names that we culturally managed to get our mouths around, like Tchaikovsky. But for some reason, other names are deemed not worth the effort or attempting to pronounce them. So I think she knew what I was getting at through my questions, and the class, the rest of my peers knew what I was getting at. Everyone kind of quieting down. And it can be tricky sometimes in those situations. Like you don't want to be the person that's essentially like the party pooper, like everyone's laughing and you kind of douse that. But it just felt really important for me to do that. And I'll come back to this point that I was making before of like, this is the difference between being passive and being active with your views on race, right? Because I could have just stayed quiet. I could have just chosen, oh, I'm not going to laugh at this, or I'm going to leave, I feel uncomfortable, or whatever. But I was like, there's no way for anyone really to know what is wrong about this situation if I just do that, if I just keep quiet, or if I leave. No one will really notice, or if they do notice, they'll be like, oh, that was a bit funny, or I wonder why she did that. And there's just too much space for interpretation, right? And there's no opportunity for change there. So I didn't want this girl to feel bad, but I wanted her to feel accountable. I wanted everyone to feel accountable because we were all laughing and things, you know what I mean? We were all engaging with the story. And I genuinely felt sorry for the girl that had gone through this, that had been nicknamed. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that it wasn't okay and that this wasn't something that we should do. This is not a moment for us to all go back out now after this class and go, oh, I'm going to nickname a student, I'm going to do that, or whatever. And I'm sure she had the best intentions, because like I was saying, she was very much relaying it like it was a triumph. And I don't think she was trying to like, you know, own this child, but essentially changing someone's name, you christening him, it's quite a powerful act. And it warrants a good level of intimacy and consent. And I don't feel like she was aware of that, and of the power dynamic of that, and the cultural insensitivity of that, and what she was communicating to the class about this girl's name. And what is it that you're saying, that you're not worthy of us trying to pronounce your name, that you need to become more like us, we need you to appropriate this situation and have a name that sounds more British or sounds more acceptable. So all of that, I was just like, I can't stand for that, and I can't just be passive in that. I'm gonna have to say something, and even if it means that she's going to be upset or everyone's not going to be laughing anymore, then I'm willing to sacrifice that. I'm willing to sacrifice that if it means that another student doesn't go through what this student's just gone through. So yeah, thank you, Marie, you saying worked with a person whose name had been changed by a teacher and it had a big impact on her mentally. Yeah, definitely. It really does. It really, really does. Because you're so impressionable at that age. You're already trying to fit in. There's already so much going on for you, hormones, whatnot. People probably giving you nicknames outside of class anyway. So to then be in class and a teacher to do it, it's just really not appropriate. And I know there are times when you can have a nickname with a student. I know I had situations where I had a really great rapport with a teacher and they might have called me this or called me that, but it was very much consented and we were both on the same page with it. So I just think we really do need to be careful about the power of language in the classroom, particularly around people's names, and the effort that we put in to pronounce names that may not be familiar to us. And I always try to make an effort. I'm not perfect. I get people's names wrong all the time, but I'll say to someone, please correct me. Like, please correct me. Have I said it right? And I'll make a note in my head of, I'll make like weird associations to try my best to get someone's name into my head. Yeah. So there is a campaign by an organisation called Race Equality Matters, and it's called My Name Is. So I just wanted to share it with you now, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. So what they've got is this function on their webpage where you can essentially find out how to spell your name phonetically and share it with people. So this is another campaign where it's very clear, you can sign up to it, and they've got some very clear actions as to what you can do. So again, it's just putting it out there that, you know, let's not make assumptions. We won't always know how to pronounce people's names, or people might not be able to pronounce your name, and we shouldn't assume that everyone comes from the same place and would just automatically just know. So why don't we just make it easy for people and just go and just have something in our like email signature or whatever else. It's like, oh, this is how you pronounce my name. It's just as simple as that. And then it just gets all of that awkwardness away. So this is something that they're really pushing for. So they've got this thing on their website where you can put your name in. It's called the phonetic filter. And it comes up with a little square of how you can spell your name. And I think you can kind of rejig it. So they'll give you a few options, and then they've put, you know, you can put this on your social media, you can put it in your email, like you can do whatever you want with it. but it's a way to kind of share with colleagues and other people of like, oh, you know, this is my name and this is how you pronounce it. So I think this is a really cool campaign. I think it's very positive, very forward thinking. And I just wanted to share it with you all and just give the opportunity, if you want, to do it. So I put my name in and this is what came out, which I thought was interesting because I thought it would have came out with Key, so like key, because that's what I said to people. I'm like, oh, it's key like key in a door. But it's done double E, Keisha. So yeah, you can click the thing at the bottom and it will like pronounce it for you and ask, you know, is this right? Is this the right pronunciation associated with their phonetic version of your name? So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to go and play with that if you want. Yeah, just go and check out that website and just see what your phonetic name is. Okay, so I hope you've had some fun there, or at least you've banked that link and you'll do it in your own time and hopefully share it with other people, because I think it's a great campaign. And I've not done it yet, but I'm definitely going to put this in my email signature because I get called all kinds of things. I really love it when I go to, one of my brothers lives in Blackburn and I get called Keisha. I remember it took me a while. I was sat in my sister-in-law's living room and her mum was like offering me a cup of tea and I was like, who is she talking to? I was like, who is that she keeps referring to? I was like, Keisha. But yeah, so I always just find it really funny when people mispronounce my name. And I'm quite happy to just correct them. But as we know, it's not always the case for everyone, and things like this helps us to just open up the conversation and keep it moving. Yeah, so for many of you that are familiar with the World Reimagined and familiar with our resources, you'll know that we have 5 C's that we use as a reference as our kind of pedagogical foundation. These are the skills that we are very much galvanized by in creating this program, in setting up our resources. And these are the skills that we would love to instill in the young people, develop in the young people that engage with our resources. And we really hope that you also feel that you can demonstrate them as leaders in your classroom, and can be advocates for the world reimagined. So those 5 C's are compassion, curiosity, courage, connection, and critical thinking. But what I wanted to do just in the context of this talk today around language is share another set of 5 C's. So I think what I've been very clear about today is that it's all about context. So when we're using language, we really need to understand where a word has come from and what situation we're using it in now, and if it's appropriate or not. And as long as we are aware of those two things, then we can feel justified in our use of language. Because like I said, there's never going to be a right or wrong. Someone will always have a different opinion, or someone will not understand what you mean, and that's just the nature of things. But if we're able to say, oh, this is where I got the word from, or this is how long it's been used, or I was using it in this context, then it just helps us to move forward and understand each other more. Second point is comfort. So again, checking in with people. How does this word make you feel? How does it make you feel? How do I feel when I use this word? Am I comfortable? Is that something that I need to be aware of, or respond to, check in with, interrogate? Why does it make me feel this way? Is that valid, or am I being oversensitive? What's my experience with this word? Does that represent the wider group? Is that something to bring up? All very valid questions. So for example, I worked in an arts organisation a few years ago, and we were talking about the phrase people of colour. Now, at the time, the organisation was using that on all of its marketing materials, and we were like, yeah, cool, that's the phrase of the time, like it's still being used now. But when they actually checked in with us, me and a colleague, we were like, I don't actually like the phrase. I still use it in certain contexts because I know that people know what I mean when I say it. And it's appropriate right now. And I know that it was coined by 3 Black women in America, so I'm like comfortable with where it's come from. But at the same time, for me, it's just a weird phrase, and I just find it a bit logically, it doesn't land properly in my head. So the only way that I have been able to feel more comfortable with using it is I looked up whether people of whiteness was also a phrase, and it is. So I use both. So I'm like, I'm only happy to use the word people of colour if I can also use the word people of whiteness. And when I've used it in my training around anti-racism, a lot of people have said, is that a phrase? And I'm like, yeah, people of whiteness is a phrase. And they've been like, why? And I'm like, well, why not? If we're going to use people of colour, if we're going to homogenise and group all people who are not white, then we should also group and homogenise everyone who's white as well, right? So that we're not, again, pandering to this asymmetry, to this default to othering people and then putting other people at the centre. And I've just said, if you don't like the phrase people of whiteness, then consider whether you want to use the phrase people of colour. Just consider it, because however it makes you feel, that's how it makes me feel. And then it's a conversation, right? As opposed to, like I was saying before, a judgment thing of like, don't use that phrase. Why are you using that phrase? That upsets me. It's not that. It's more of a kind of like, oh, and kind of bouncing around and having a chat. But yeah, so for me, I just find it kind of logically annoying. Whereas one of my other colleagues said that she finds it quite triggering because it reminds her of the phrase, the word coloured, which, as we know, is definitely contentious now and doesn't get used. So she was like, it just draws on that for me, and I just don't like it. So they checked in with us and they were like, okay, we're really sorry that this word makes you feel like this. Are you still comfortable for us to use it on our market? And we were like, well, yeah, because a lot of people use it and they're fine with it. So it's fine. But if we're leading a workshop, for example, or doing this, we probably won't use it. So it's just about that negotiation. And we just felt a lot more comfortable in that organization because they just checked in with us and they just asked us the question and didn't make an assumption that we'd immediately be comfortable with it. Consistent. So one of the things I said at the very, very top is just how consistent are you with the word or the idea of using words? So if you are going to describe someone's race, in whatever context, it might be you writing up something, you writing a story or whatever, are you doing that for everyone? Are you describing everyone's race or only certain people's race? And if you are, why? So it's just checking in with yourself about how consistent you are when you are talking about race. Which groups do you use it with and which do you not, and why? Change, embracing the idea of change. So words change meaning. Semantic change is an absolute thing. We've seen it with so many different phrases. We just have to stay on top of it. So as I was saying, when the phrase BAME first came out, it was very functional. It was used for like the context of statistics, and loads of like different governmental and non-governmental organizations were using it because they were having to document people's race and ethnicities, right? But obviously it just got out of hand and was being used in all these different contexts, and people eventually pushed back and they're like, do you know what, I don't like this phrase, I don't like it. It means something else for me, and it feels sloppy, it feels offensive, it's homogenizing, blah blah blah. So we just have to appreciate that what might be okay now may not be okay in the future. Things that we know were okay, they're definitely not okay now, and that's just life, because words are an extension of us. They're a manifestation of how we want to connect with each other, and what our cultural activities are. I love the fact that I can't remember the exact number, but I know that there's probably like, I think it's over 20 or over 30 even different words for snow in, I think it's Greenland. Of course there is, because they've got so much snow there, and they've got such more of like an interesting, intimate relationship with snow, that they can categorize it in ways that we couldn't even possibly imagine. So of course they've got so many different words for the word snow. So yeah, words speak for who we are as a group of people, and it's up for grabs. So I love thinking about semantic change and the fact that we can make up words. I always say to young people, look, Shakespeare was making up words all the time. So go forth with your slang, and be an inventor. Okay, so last one is check. I know, who was it before? Talking about the word pride. Emma. Yeah, so you're saying, yeah, just check. Just check. If you're not sure, if you don't know how to pronounce someone's name, you don't know where words come from, you're not sure of the context, just check. Just ask someone. Make sure you check with the right person though, yeah? Don't just check with yourself. Just like, am I all right with this word? Yeah, okay, cool. No, do some research, ask a few people, and then we move forward. We're informed and it's fine. So they're my 5 C's, in particular reference to how we think about language when we are looking at this topic of racial justice. Any questions before I wrap this up? And again, I say thank you for joining me. I know we are all having very, very long days, and it's Easter holidays for some people. So I really do appreciate you joining and listening to me and engaging, and I hope it's been useful. And I just want to give space to anyone who wants to ask a question or give a reflection of any sort before we wrap up for the evening. Okie dokie. So I've shared all the links that I can. When all of these talks are done, there will be an email that will go out to everyone that has all of the recordings and should have like my slides and stuff like that. So anything that you've missed, I hope that you'll get an opportunity to come back to it. And yeah, thank you very much, Marie. Thanks, Emma. And yeah, I hope you all have a very good evening. And if you're joining me tomorrow, then please do. We'll be talking about well-being, as mentioned, well-being for ourselves and well-being for the young people or participants. They might not all be young people that we engage with. Cool. Bye. Have a good evening. Thanks.